I'm Sienna, 32 years old, and while carving the holiday turkey at Thanksgiving dinner with 14 family members watching, my unmotivated sister Blair announced she'd be moving into my new flat next month. The knife paused mid-slice through the golden breast meat as every conversation died. My mother beamed. My father nodded approvingly. Blair's smug smile stretched wider as she added, "Sienna won't mind sharing. She's always been so generous with family." The ceramic serving platter felt suddenly heavy in my left hand. Around the dining table, my aunts and uncles exchanged knowing glances, probably remembering the countless times I'd bailed Blair out of her self-created disasters. My grandmother reached over to pat my hand sympathetically, her arthritic fingers cold against my skin, but I didn't crumble. I didn't argue. Instead, I set down the carving knife with deliberate precision, picked up my wine glass, and took a long, measured sip of the Pinot Noir I'd brought specifically for this meal. "That's wonderful news, Blair," I said, my voice steady and almost cheerful. "I'm sure you'll love the neighborhood." Blair had been my shadow growing up, but not in the adorable little sister way. From age 5, I'd understood that my role in the family was to clean up after her messes, cover for her mistakes, and pretend her constant failures were just bad luck rather than deliberate choices. When she dropped out of community college after one semester, I was the one who explained to disappointed relatives that college wasn't for everyone. When she quit her 4th retail job in 2 years, I helped update her resume and contacted my professional network. When her boyfriend kicked her out after she refused to contribute to rent, I let her crash on my couch for just a few weeks that stretched into 7 months. The difference between us was stark. I'd worked 2 jobs through college, graduated with honors in urban planning, and spent 5 years climbing from junior analyst to project coordinator at a respected development firm. I saved aggressively, lived below my means, and finally saved enough for a down payment on a 1-bedroom flat in a gentrifying neighborhood near the city center. Blair, meanwhile, had drifted through her 20s working part-time shifts at a coffee shop, spending her paychecks on concert tickets and weekend trips, and living in our parents' basement rent-free. 3 months ago, I'd closed on my flat and begun renovations. The place was a complete gut job, stripped down to studs and concrete, awaiting the custom kitchen I'd designed, the bathroom tiles I'd personally selected, and the built-in shelving that would transform the cramped space into something functional and beautiful. I'd taken out a modest renovation loan, carefully budgeted every expense, and spent weekends stripping wallpaper and sanding floors. The flat represented 7 years of sacrifice and discipline, and it was entirely, completely mine. Blair had visited once during the renovation, walked through the construction debris, and made dismissive comments about the neighborhood being kind of sketchy and the building being pretty old. She'd left after 20 minutes, claiming the dust was bothering her allergies. I'd felt relieved when she left, grateful for the temporary reprieve from her judgment. But apparently Blair had been paying more attention than I'd realized. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I'd mentioned to my mother during our weekly phone call that the renovations were nearly complete and I'd be moving in after the holidays. I described the custom details, the natural light flooding through the newly installed windows, and my excitement about finally having my own space. What I didn't mention was the security deposit I'd carefully selected, the triple bolt locks I'd personally installed, or the building's strict lease terms that prohibited unauthorized occupants. My mother had listened with what I'd interpreted as maternal pride. Now, watching her smile indulgently at Blair across the Thanksgiving table, I understood she'd been gathering intelligence. "Sienna's flat is perfect for Blair," my mother continued, addressing the assembled family as though I weren't sitting right there. "It's in a safe area, close to public transportation, and Blair needs stability right now." The coffee shop cut her hours again. The implication hung in the air that I, the responsible older sister, would naturally provide that stability. That my hard-earned home would become Blair's latest safety net. That my boundaries, my privacy, my investment would all be subsumed into the family's collective expectation that I would always, always take care of Blair. My father cleared his throat. "It makes financial sense. Blair can contribute to utilities and groceries while she gets back on her feet. And Sienna," he fixed me with that particular look that had guilted me into 1,000 compromises. "You've always said family comes first." Around the table, heads nodded. My Uncle Marcus mentioned how his own daughters had shared an apartment for years. My Aunt Diane recalled when she'd let her younger brother stay with her during his divorce. The precedents stacked up, each one another brick in the wall of obligation they were building around me. Blair's expression had shifted from smug to victorious. She knew this script by heart. The family would rally around her need, frame my resources as communal property, and shame me into compliance if I dared object. It had worked when she'd crashed on my couch. It had worked when I'd co-signed her car loan that she defaulted on. It had worked every single time because I'd been too afraid of being labeled selfish. Too desperate to maintain family harmony, too trained to put everyone else's needs above my own. But something had changed in me during those months of renovation. Stripping down walls, I'd stripped away my own layers of people-pleasing. Choosing each design element, I'd chosen to prioritize my own vision. Installing those triple bolt locks, I'd locked out the version of myself who bent to every demand. The renovation had taught me that I could build something from nothing, that I could trust my own judgment, and that protecting what I'd built wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Actually, I said, resuming my carving of the turkey with smooth, confident strokes, the lease is quite specific about occupancy. Single occupancy only. No roommates, no long-term guests. Building policy. Blair's smile faltered. You could just not tell them. I could, I agreed, separating the drumstick from the thigh with surgical precision. But I'm not going to. The temperature in the dining room dropped several degrees. My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish. My father's face reddened. Blair's expression morphed from confidence to confusion to the beginning of genuine concern. Sienna, my mother began, her voice taking on that particular tone of disappointment she'd perfected over 32 years of guilting me into submission. Surely you can make an exception for family. No, I said simply, and the single word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I can't. What they didn't know, what I'd carefully kept hidden during my enthusiastic descriptions of the renovation, was that I'd made very different arrangements for my new home. Arrangements that would soon become clear to everyone at this table. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds before Blair's face contorted with genuine panic. What do you mean, no? You're my sister, which is precisely why I know this wouldn't be temporary. I placed perfectly carved slices of turkey onto the platter, each piece uniform and deliberate. You stayed on my couch for 7 months, Blair. You were supposed to stay 2 weeks. My grandmother's eyes brightened with interest. She'd been the only family member who'd ever questioned why I constantly sacrificed for Blair. The rest of the table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their empty plates. That was different, Blair protested, her voice climbing higher. I was going through a breakup. I needed support. You needed free housing while you partied every weekend and came home at 3 a.m. The carving knife moved smoothly through the breast meat. You contributed exactly $0 to groceries or utilities during those 7 months. You left dirty dishes in my sink for days. You borrowed my clothes without asking and returned them stained. You invited friends over when I explicitly asked you not to. I was depressed, Blair said, but her eyes darted to our mother for backup. You were entitled, I corrected. And when you finally moved out, you took my coffee maker, my good bath towels, and that cashmere sweater Grandma gave me for Christmas. You still haven't returned any of them. My mother's hand flew to her chest. Sienna, this isn't the time or place. Actually, it's the perfect time. I set down the carving knife and faced the table directly, because I want everyone here to understand something. The flat I purchased is mine. I saved for 7 years while working 2 jobs. I chose every fixture, every tile, every paint color. I took out a renovation loan that I'll be paying off for the next decade. And I will not, I emphasized each word, allow anyone to treat my home the way Blair treated my apartment. Blair's chair scraped against the hardwood floor as she stood abruptly. This is unbelievable. I can't believe you're being so selfish. Sit down, my grandmother said quietly, and something in her tone made Blair obey immediately. Let your sister finish. I nodded gratefully toward my grandmother. What I haven't told anyone yet is that I've already rented out the second bedroom. The table erupted. My mother gasped. My father demanded to know what second bedroom. Blair's face went white, then red, then white again. It's a 1-bedroom flat, my father said slowly. You told us it was 1 bedroom. The official floor plan lists it as 1 bedroom. I agreed, but the renovation included converting the large storage closet into a proper second bedroom with its own window, closet, and everything required to meet housing code. I got the permits, did the work properly, and had it inspected and approved. The flat is now legally a 2-bedroom. The realization dawned slowly across Blair's face. She'd seen the flat during renovation. She'd walked past that storage closet, made comments about how small it was, and left before the conversion began. She'd assumed she knew everything about my new home based on one dismissive visit. You did that secretly, my mother accused. You deliberately hid it from family. I didn't hide anything. I simply didn't announce my private business decisions to everyone. I reached for my wine glass again, enjoying the weight of control in my hand. And yes, I've already rented that second bedroom to a medical resident named Quinn who works night shifts at City Hospital. She signed a 1-year lease 3 weeks ago. She moves in December 15th. Her security deposit and first month's rent have already cleared. You could rent to your own sister instead, my father said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Family should come before strangers. Quinn will pay $1,200 monthly for that room, plus half utilities. She'll be working 80-hour weeks and barely home. She has excellent references, a stable career, and her parents co-signed her lease because she's responsible enough to acknowledge that at 26 years old, she needs guarantors for financial commitments. I looked directly at Blair. When's the last time you paid market rate for housing? Blair's mouth opened and closed. She'd never paid market rate for anything in her life. Our parents charged her $200 monthly for their basement, a token amount that she regularly paid late or skipped entirely. I'll pay rent, Blair said desperately. I'll pay whatever Quinn is paying. Can you? I asked simply. Can you pay $1,200 monthly, plus utilities, plus groceries, plus transportation? You're working part-time at a coffee shop. You told Mom they cut your hours. Do the math, Blair. Her silence was answer enough. This is cruel, my mother said, tears forming in her eyes. This is your sister. She needs help. She needs to help herself, I replied. And this family has enabled her long enough. My Uncle Marcus cleared his throat. Perhaps everyone should take a breath. This is Thanksgiving. We can discuss housing arrangements another time, but I wasn't finished. Blair, when exactly were you planning to ask me if you could move in? Or were you just going to show up with your suitcases and assume I'd cave like always? The guilty flicker in her eyes told me everything. She'd planned exactly that scenario. Wait until after the holidays when it would be harder for me to refuse, show up claiming she'd already given up the basement room, force me into a corner where saying no would make me look heartless. I thought you'd want to help me, Blair said, and real tears started flowing now. I thought sisters supported each other. Support is reciprocal, I said. What have you ever done to support me, Blair? Actually, don't answer that. Let me tell you what you've done instead. I pulled out my phone, opened my carefully organized notes app, and began reading. $15,000. That's how much you've cost me over the past 7 years. $4,000 in that car loan you defaulted on that destroyed my credit score. $3,000 in rent and utilities during your 7-month couch surfing adventure. $2,000 in various loans you've never repaid. $1,000 in belongings you've borrowed and never returned. And $5,000 in lost opportunities. Job interviews I missed because I had to cover your shifts, networking events I skipped because I was dealing with your crises, and the promotion I didn't get because I couldn't work late for 6 months while you were living with me. The numbers hung in the air like accusations. I'd never totaled them before, never confronted anyone with the actual cost of Blair's entitlement. But during the renovation, during those long nights of stripping wallpaper and planning my future, I'd done the math. I'd calculated exactly how much of my life I'd sacrificed at the altar of family obligation. You kept track? Blair whispered, looking genuinely wounded. You kept track like some kind of accountant? I'm an urban planner, I corrected. I'm trained to analyze costs and benefits, and the cost-benefit analysis of continuing to enable you is extremely clear. My grandmother actually smiled. My mother looked like I'd slapped her. My father's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping. If you needed money, my father began, but I cut him off. This isn't about money. This is about boundaries. This is about Blair being 29 years old and still expecting everyone else to solve her problems. This is about me finally saying no. Blair grabbed her coat from the back of her chair. I don't have to listen to this. You're right, I agreed. You don't. But I want you to understand something clearly before you leave. I will not be changing my mind. I will not be making exceptions. I will not be guilted, manipulated, or pressured into letting you move into my home. That door is closed, locked, and will remain that way. She stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions, shock, anger, betrayal, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. What Blair didn't know was that I'd already discovered her backup plan, and that discovery was going to change everything. Blair stormed out of Thanksgiving dinner with our mother following close behind, offering comfort and promises that Sienna will come around. Through the dining room window, I watched them stand beside Blair's dented Honda, heads bent together in urgent conversation. My father excused himself, probably to call and add his own reassurances that I'd eventually see reason. My grandmother waited until they'd left before speaking. You found something. It wasn't a question. Grandma had always been perceptive, but her certainty startled me. I nodded slowly. 2 weeks ago, I went to my parents' house to drop off some kitchen items I'd replaced during the renovation. No one was home, but the basement door was unlocked. I went down to put some old pots in storage, and that's when I saw Blair's room. My Uncle Marcus leaned forward, interested despite himself. What was in her room? Research, I said carefully. Printed articles about tenant rights, squatters' laws, and how to establish residency. Highlighted sections about how difficult it is to evict family members once they've moved in. Notes about the 30-day rule. How after someone lives somewhere for a month, you can't just kick them out without going through formal eviction proceedings. The table went quiet. Even my Aunt Diane, who usually defended Blair reflexively, looked troubled. There was more, I continued, my voice steady despite the anger still burning in my chest. A folder with information about my building. Photos she'd taken during her visit. Not just of my flat, but of the mailboxes, the building entrance, the super's apartment. She'd written down the super's name, his schedule, and notes about how he's old and probably doesn't check lease agreements carefully. My grandmother's expression hardened. She was planning to forge your permission. That's what it looked like to me. There was a draft email to the building management claiming she was my approved occupant, along with a fake rental agreement she'd created using online templates. She'd even practiced my signature on a separate sheet of paper. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos I'd taken of Blair's planning materials. She wasn't hoping to move in. She was plotting to move in, regardless of my permission, and then used tenant laws to make it nearly impossible for me to remove her. Jesus Christ. Uncle Marcus breathed. That's not just entitled, that's criminal. It's certainly fraud, I agreed. And once I saw all this, I realized I needed to protect myself more carefully than I'd planned. That discovery had sent me into a spiral of paranoid research. I'd spent 3 sleepless nights reading tenant law, consulting with a real estate attorney, and documenting everything. The lawyer had been blunt. If Blair managed to establish residency in my flat, removing her would require a formal eviction process that could take months and cost thousands. Even with proof she'd moved in without permission, even with no lease agreement, the law heavily favored occupants once they'd been in a place for 30 days. The solution had been expensive but necessary. I'd upgraded my building's security, adding my photo to the approved residence list with explicit instructions that no one else was authorized. I'd met personally with the building super, explaining that I had a family member who might try to gain access without my permission. I'd paid for a security camera outside my flat door, monitoring who approached my entrance. And most importantly, I documented everything. Every conversation with Blair, every request for money, every boundary she'd violated. That's why you rented the second bedroom so quickly, my grandmother said, understanding dawning. You needed someone legitimate in place before Blair could claim it. Exactly. Quinn's lease is ironclad. She has legal right to that space, which means Blair can't claim it's available. And Quinn's parents are both attorneys who carefully reviewed every clause before co-signing. If Blair tries anything, showing up with her belongings, claiming I promised her the room, attempting to establish residency, I have a co-tenant with legal standing and resources to fight back. You've been planning this for weeks, Uncle Marcus said with something that sounded like admiration. While Blair was planning her little invasion, you were fortifying your defenses. I learned from the couch surfing disaster, I said. That time, she'd asked if she could just crash for a couple days after her breakup. I said yes out of sympathy, not realizing she'd interpreted that as indefinite permission. By the time I tried to establish boundaries, she'd been there long enough that she felt entitled to stay. She had mail coming to my address. She'd changed her voter registration. She'd told everyone that was her home now. Getting her to leave took months of arguments and family pressure, and even then she only left because she found a new boyfriend with his own place. And now she's single again, my grandmother observed. How convenient that her hours got cut right when your renovation finished. The implication hung heavy in the air. I'd suspected that timing wasn't coincidental. But hearing my grandmother state it plainly made my stomach turn. Had Blair deliberately sabotaged her own employment to create a housing crisis that would force me into taking her in? I don't know if she got her hours cut or if she quit, I admitted. But either way, I'm not rescuing her from consequences of her own choices. Not anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Very disappointed in your behavior today. Blair is crying. Dad and I are taking her to dinner because you've upset her so much she can't eat. We need to talk about your attitude. I showed the message to my grandmother, who snorted. Your mother's been enabling Blair since she was 5 years old. Remember when Blair cheated on that math test in middle school? I did remember. Blair had been caught red-handed with answers written on her palm. Instead of facing consequences, my mother had argued with the teacher until they agreed to let Blair retake the test. The lesson Blair learned wasn't about honesty. It was that Mom would always bail her out. What are you going to do now? Uncle Marcus asked. They're not going to let this go easily. I know. I'd been thinking about this exact scenario for weeks, running through every possible response, every guilt trip, every manipulation tactic my family might deploy. But I've already committed. The lease is signed. Quinn moves in December 15th, and I'm prepared for whatever comes next. What I didn't say, what I was still deciding whether to reveal, was the second folder I'd found in Blair's room, the one that made her housing scheme look almost innocent by comparison. It contained printouts of my bank statements. I'd discovered them in a manila envelope hidden under Blair's mattress. Somehow, she'd accessed my online banking. Probably during one of her visits when I'd been in the bathroom and left my laptop unlocked. She'd taken screenshots of my account balances, my transaction history, and most alarmingly, the details of my renovation loan. She knew exactly how much debt I was carrying. She knew exactly how tight my budget would be for the next year. She'd done research on cosigner obligations and loan default procedures, and she'd written calculations in the margins. If S defaults, can we claim hardship? Who inherits debt? Can parents take over property? My sister hadn't just been planning to invade my home. She'd been calculating how to claim it if I failed financially. The renovation loan was substantial, $40,000 at a relatively high interest rate because it was unsecured. I'd budgeted carefully, running the numbers dozens of times to ensure I could manage the monthly payments alongside my mortgage, but it would be tight for the next year. Very tight. Any unexpected expense could tip me into trouble, and Blair knew that. She'd been counting on it. Sienna, my grandmother's voice pulled me back to the present. You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost, I said slowly, just realizing how much worse this could have been. My grandmother studied my face with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. There's more to this story. There is, I admitted, but I'm not ready to talk about all of it yet. I need to verify some things first. That night, after the disaster of Thanksgiving dinner had finally ended, I drove to my flat and sat in my car outside the building for a long time. The renovated space waited upstairs, beautiful, functional, and entirely mine. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of the new light fixtures I'd installed, the clean lines of the custom shelving, the careful work of 7 years of sacrifice. Blair had wanted to take all of that. She'd researched how to infiltrate my home, establish residency I couldn't legally fight, and potentially claim my property if I stumbled financially under the weight of her presence. She'd underestimated me. She'd seen me as the same pushover sister who'd always caved to family pressure, always prioritized peace over boundaries, always chose guilt over self-preservation. But renovation had taught me that sometimes you have to tear everything down to the studs before you can build something stronger. And I'd torn down more than just walls. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Blair directly. "I can't believe you humiliated me like that in front of everyone. You're supposed to be my sister." I typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on, "I am your sister," which is exactly why I know this needs to stop. Her response came immediately. "You'll regret this. You're not the only one who can make plans." I stared at that message for a long time. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't not a threat either. It was Blair showing her hand, revealing that she had contingencies I didn't know about. But so did I, and mine were about to be activated. The eviction notice appeared on my parents' door exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving. I knew because my mother called me at 7 in the morning, her voice shaking with fury and tears. "How could you do this to your own family?" I was already awake, coffee brewing in my renovated kitchen. Quinn's bedroom door closed as she slept off a 30-hour hospital shift. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Don't play innocent. The eviction notice, the property management company. You've been planning this for months." My hand stilled on the coffee pot. "Mom, I own a flat, not the house you're living in. How could I possibly evict you?" The silence on the other end told me she was recalculating, realizing her accusation didn't make logical sense. "But you, someone, what exactly does the notice say?" She read it to me, her voice breaking on every other word. The house my parents had lived in for 23 years was being sold. The new owner was not renewing their lease. They had 60 days to vacate. "I'm sorry, Mom. That's awful, but I don't understand why you thought I had anything to do with it." "Because Blair said—" She stopped abruptly. "Blair said what?" Another long silence. "Never mind. I need to go." She hung up before I could press further. I sat with my coffee, piecing together what must have happened. Blair had somehow learned about the eviction. Possibly the notice had been addressed to her as an occupant and immediately blamed me. Had probably spun an elaborate story about how I'd orchestrated this revenge for being denied access to my flat. Had convinced our parents that their housing crisis was my fault. My phone rang again. This time it was my father, and he didn't bother with pleasantries. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you're destroying this family." "I'm not playing any game. I had nothing to do with your landlord selling the house." "Convenient timing," he spat. "Right after you refused to help your sister. Suddenly we're all being thrown out on the street." "Dad, think about what you're saying. How would I even—" "Blair told us everything. How you've been planning this for months. How you contacted the property owner and offered to buy the house yourself so you could evict us. How you want us to suffer because we stood up for your sister." The accusations were so absurd I actually laughed, which was apparently the worst response possible. My father's voice went cold. "This isn't funny, Sienna. Your mother is having panic attacks. Blair is devastated. We trusted you. You trusted Blair's lies." I corrected. "Dad, I'm looking at my bank statements right now. I can prove I haven't contacted any property owners or made any offers on any houses. This is completely separate from my situation with Blair." "Then explain the timing." "I can't explain random coincidence," I said, frustration bleeding into my voice. "Sometimes bad things happen that aren't anyone's fault. But Blair is using this crisis to manipulate you into blaming me instead of facing her own situation." He hung up on me. For 3 days, my phone exploded with messages from extended family. Aunts and uncles who'd been at Thanksgiving dinner, cousins I barely spoke to, even distant relatives I'd never met. All of them had heard Blair's version of events, that I was wealthy and cruel, that I'd deliberately orchestrated my parents' eviction, that I was punishing the entire family for not taking my side. The narrative had gone viral within our family tree. I was the villain of Blair's carefully crafted story, and without access to my parents or the ability to defend myself directly to everyone Blair had poisoned against me, I watched my reputation shred in real time. Then Quinn came home from a shift and found me staring at my phone, contemplating whether responding to the attacks would make things better or worse. "You okay?" she asked, still in her scrubs, exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. I explained the situation in broad strokes. Quinn listened silently, then said something that changed everything. "Did your sister access your banking information illegally?" "Probably. I never gave her permission." "And she's making provably false claims about you buying property?" Yes. Do you have proof of the illegal access and documentation of her false claims? I thought about the folder of screenshots I'd taken in Blair's room. I have photos of printed bank statements she shouldn't have had access to. And I have all the text messages where she's making accusations I can disprove. Quinn pulled out her phone. My mother's a criminal defense attorney. My father's a civil litigation specialist. Want me to ask them some hypothetical questions about fraud, identity theft, and defamation. 3 hours later, I was on a video call with Quinn's parents, showing them everything I'd documented over the past month. The bank statements Blair had printed, the fake rental agreement she'd drafted, the notes about establishing residency against my will, the text messages making false accusations about the property sale. This is actually quite serious, Quinn's mother said, her professional demeanor sharpening. Unauthorized access to financial accounts, even if she's family, is a federal crime. Creating fraudulent documents with intent to use them is fraud. And if she's making these accusations publicly in a way that damages your reputation or finances, that's defamation. I don't want to put my sister in jail, I said immediately. You might not have to, Quinn's father interjected. Sometimes the threat of legal consequences is enough to stop the behavior. Has your sister made these accusations in writing? Text messages, emails, social media? I scrolled through my phone. Screenshot after screenshot of Blair's increasingly unhinged messages. Accusations that I'd sabotaged her job. Claims that I'd bribed the landlord to evict our parents. Threats that she'd expose me for crimes I hadn't committed. This is a paper trail, Quinn's father said with satisfaction. This shows a pattern of false accusations, escalating rhetoric, and arguably harassment. Combined with the evidence of her planning to fraudulently access your property, you have grounds for a restraining order at minimum. But here's what I'd recommend, Quinn's mother added. Before any legal action, you arrange a family meeting. Present the evidence. Make it clear that you have documentation of everything she's done, and that further false accusations will result in legal consequences. Give her a chance to stop before you go nuclear. Ari, she'll spin it, I said. She'll claim I'm threatening her or trying to silence her or, which is why you bring witnesses, Quinn's father interrupted. Independent parties who can verify what's said. And you record the meeting with everyone's knowledge and consent. You make this official. The family meeting happened 5 days later at my grandmother's house. I'd chosen the location deliberately, neutral territory, but with someone present who'd already indicated she was on my side. My parents arrived with Blair, both of them looking defensive and exhausted. My uncle Marcus came as my witness, along with Quinn's father as my attorney, which made everything feel suddenly, seriously real. Blair went pale when she saw the attorney. "This is ridiculous," my mother said immediately. "We're not doing some kind of trial." "This is a presentation of facts," Quinn's father said calmly. "Sienna has documentation she'd like to share with you. You're welcome to leave if you'd prefer, but she felt you deserved to see the evidence before deciding how to proceed legally." "Legally?" My father's face reddened. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm protecting myself," I said, opening my laptop. "For the past month, Blair has been making accusations against me that are provably false. She's told you I bought your house to evict you, which is completely untrue. I'm going to show you evidence that demonstrates not only is that impossible, but that Blair has been planning something much worse for much longer." I displayed the photos on my laptop screen. One by one, I showed them what I'd found in Blair's room. The printed bank statements, the squatters' rights research, the fake rental agreement, the notes about establishing residency, the practiced forgeries of my signature. My mother's face went white. My father's mouth opened and closed without sound. Blair stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. "You went through my private things," she accused. "You had no right. You accessed my private bank accounts," I countered, "and planned to commit fraud to gain access to my property without my permission. I was just researching options." "You practiced forging my signature," I said, pulling up that specific photo. "You documented my building's security. You created a fake rental agreement. This wasn't research, Blair. This was conspiracy to commit fraud." My father found his voice. "Blair, tell me this isn't real." "She's twisting everything," Blair said desperately. "I was just trying to understand my options because she was being so unreasonable." "These are federal crimes," Quinn's father said quietly. "Unauthorized access to financial accounts, identity fraud, attempted theft by deception. Your sister has grounds to press criminal charges if she chooses." The air went out of the room. My mother sank into her chair. My father stared at Blair like he'd never seen her before. Blair herself looked trapped, cornered, her usual confidence completely shattered. "But here's what's going to happen instead," I continued. "Blair is going to stop making false accusations about me. She's going to publicly correct every lie she's told the family about me buying your house or sabotaging her employment. She's going to stay away from my property, my building, and my personal information. And if she violates any of these terms, I will pursue legal action. These photos will be submitted to authorities. Federal charges will be filed." "You can't do this," Blair whispered. "I'm your sister. You were willing to steal from me," I replied. "You researched how to invade my home against my will. You tried to destroy my reputation when I set boundaries. You're not acting like my sister, Blair. You're acting like a criminal who happens to share my DNA. My grandmother spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension. Blair, do you have anything to say for yourself? Any explanation for this betrayal? Blair's face crumpled. But instead of apologizing, she pointed at me. This is your fault. If you'd just helped me like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened. Sisters are supposed to support each other. Support isn't unconditional enabling, I said, and this conversation is over. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry about your housing situation. That's genuinely not my doing, and I can prove it if necessary. But I will not be Blair's solution. Not now, not ever. She needs to learn to solve her own problems. My mother was crying silently. My father couldn't meet my eyes. Blair stood there shaking, the full consequences of her actions finally registering on her face. You're going to regret this, Blair said, but her voice had lost all its earlier venom. Now she just sounded scared. No, I said with absolute certainty. I really won't. The family meeting's aftermath spread through our relatives faster than Blair's lies had. My uncle Marcus, who'd witnessed everything, apparently made some phone calls. Within 24 hours, the cousins and aunts and uncles who'd been sending me angry messages were backtracking, apologizing, claiming they'd been misled. I accepted none of the apologies. I'd seen how quickly they'd believed the worst about me, how eager they'd been to pile on without asking for my side. The family unity I'd spent 32 years trying to preserve had been conditional all along, dependent on my continued willingness to sacrifice myself for Blair's comfort. My parents' housing crisis resolved itself in an unexpected way. The buyer of their rental house was a development company planning to renovate and resell. The company offered my parents first right to purchase the renovated property at a 15% markup from the sale price. It was actually a decent deal given the neighborhood's rising property values, but it would require a down payment they didn't have. They called me 3 days after the family meeting. My mother's voice was small, tentative. Sienna, we need to talk about a loan. I almost laughed at the audacity. No, we wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. We've lived in this house for over 2 decades. Blair grew up here. We can't just lose it. Blair is 29 years old. She doesn't need her childhood home. She needs to launch into adulthood, which you've prevented by making everything too comfortable. I kept my voice steady, unemotional. And I'm not lending you money so you can continue enabling her. That's not what this is about, my father interjected on speakerphone. This is about our home. Our security. Your security has been threatened because you rented instead of buying, didn't save adequately, and now face a housing market that's changed dramatically since you moved in 23 years ago. The urban planner in me couldn't help but analyze their situation clinically. Those were choices. Not great ones in hindsight, but choices nonetheless. And the consequences are yours to handle. When did you become so heartless? My mother whispered. When I realized that family was using love as a weapon to extract resources without reciprocation, I replied. You've called me heartless for setting boundaries. Blair called me selfish for refusing to let her invade my home, but neither of you has once acknowledged the $15,000 she's cost me over the years. Neither of you has apologized for enabling behavior that nearly resulted in her committing federal crimes against me. So no, I won't be providing a loan. You'll need to find another solution. They hung up without goodbye. Quinn emerged from her room 20 minutes later, headed for another hospital shift. You handled that perfectly, she said, pulling on her jacket. For what it's worth, my parents were impressed by how you documented everything. My mom said you'd make a good paralegal. I just wanted to protect myself, I said. That's what documentation is, Quinn replied. Protection, evidence, proof that you're not crazy when people try to gaslight you into believing you're the problem. She paused at the door. My parents also said to tell you that Blair stopped making public accusations approximately 6 hours after the family meeting. Apparently, your Uncle Marcus sent a group email with photos of her fraud planning materials attached. My stomach twisted. I didn't want him to do that. You didn't ask him to, but he was angry on your behalf, and he made a choice. Sometimes other people's actions work in our favor, even when we wouldn't have chosen them ourselves. She checked her watch. I've got to run. Just wanted you to know that Blair's been cut off from the family rumor mill. Nobody's listening to her anymore. After Quinn left, I sat in my renovated living room, surrounded by the home I'd built with my own hands and money, and felt something unexpected. Grief. Not for Blair, not for my parents, but for the family I'd imagined we could have been. The supportive, functional, mutually respectful family that existed in my childhood fantasies, but never in reality. My phone buzzed with a text from my grandmother. Lunch this week? I have some things to tell you about your mother and Blair that might provide context. We met at a cafe near her retirement community. My grandmother waited until we'd ordered before pulling out a worn photo album I'd never seen. Your mother was a lot like Blair at her age, she said, opening to photos of my mother in her 20s. Pretty, smiling, surrounded by friends who all looked vaguely uncomfortable, charming, irresponsible, always in some crisis that required rescuing. Your grandfather and I bailed her out constantly, Paid her rent, covered her debts, made excuses for her failed commitments. I never knew that, I said, studying the photos with new understanding. She doesn't like to talk about it, but when she married your father, she'd just been fired from her third job in 2 years. She was 26 and still living in our guest room rent-free. Your father was stable, employed, and willing to take on the project of fixing her. My grandmother's expression was rueful. We were relieved, honestly. Thought he'd be the one to finally make her responsible, but she just transferred the enabling to him, and then to you, when you were old enough to be useful. My grandmother closed the album. When Blair was born, I watched your mother start the same cycle, and I tried to warn her, told her she was creating another version of herself, someone who'd never learned to stand on their own because they'd never have to. She accused me of not loving my granddaughter. Is that why you're not close to Mom? Part of it. The other part is that your mother resents me for eventually cutting her off financially. When I retired and moved to a fixed income, I told her and your father that the bank of Grandma was closed. They'd need to manage their own finances without my bailouts. Your mother didn't speak to me for 2 years. She reached across the table to take my hand. I'm telling you this so you understand. You're not being cruel by setting boundaries. You're breaking a generational pattern. Your mother enabled Blair because she was enabled herself. She doesn't know any other way to show love. That's sad. I said honestly, it is, but it's not your responsibility to fix. My grandmother squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Sienna, for building something of your own, for protecting it, for refusing to perpetuate the cycle. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but as I drove home, I thought about patterns and cycles and the weight of family history. Blair wasn't just entitled because she was spoiled. She was the product of 3 generations of women who'd learned that helplessness was rewarded and independence was punished. Breaking that pattern made me the villain in their story, but I could live with that. 2 months after Thanksgiving, I received a Facebook message from Blair. I almost deleted it unread, but curiosity won out. I got a job. Full-time, decent pay, benefits. I'm moving into an apartment with 2 roommates next month. Not a great apartment, but it's mine. Well, a third mine. I'm not saying this to ask for your approval or forgiveness. Just thought you should know I'm not homeless or destroyed like you probably hoped. I'm figuring it out, no thanks to you. The message was classic Blair, unable to take responsibility even while describing responsible actions, framing her success as defiance rather than growth. But embedded in the bitterness was proof that removing my safety net had forced her to build her own. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't restart a cycle I'd deliberately ended. My parents eventually purchased their house using a loan from my uncle Marcus, who apparently had the savings they lacked. The terms were favorable. Family rate interest, flexible repayment schedule, but they had a loan nonetheless. They were building equity instead of renting, but they were also carrying debt for the first time in decades. They didn't invite me to the closing. I found out from my grandmother that they'd moved back in after renovations were complete. Neither my mother nor my father had reached out since the family meeting 3 months ago. Quinn's lease renewal came up in October, almost a year after she'd moved in. She asked if we could talk, and I braced myself for her to announce she was leaving. Instead, she suggested we convert to month-to-month terms. I'm moving in with my partner next summer, she explained, but I'd like to keep the room as a backup. I'd pay half rent for exclusive access, keep my stuff here, stay here when we fight or when I need space. Would that work for you? It would work perfectly. Half rent for a room that required minimal maintenance and would remain available for future tenants if needed. I told her yes. Also, Quinn added, I've been telling my coworkers about this place. There are 3 residents at the hospital looking for housing when I leave. All of them are clean, quiet, professionally stable. You could have your pick. The benefit of not being beholden to family became clear. Professional tenants with references and stable incomes. People who paid rent on time, respected boundaries, and understood that housing was a mutual arrangement, not an entitlement. My career advanced steadily through the year. The promotion I'd been tracking finally came through, senior project coordinator with a substantial raise. My first action with the extra money was to increase my renovation loan payments, cutting years off the repayment timeline. I also started a strict savings account labeled Emergency Fund, No Family. Every month, I added to it religiously. The balance grew slowly but steadily, a cushion against future crises that I would handle myself, without owing anyone explanations or favors. 3 years after that Thanksgiving dinner, I stood in my fully paid-off flat, both the mortgage and renovation loan cleared ahead of schedule, and assessed what I'd built. The 1-bedroom converted to 2 had appreciated significantly as the neighborhood gentrified. Property values had increased 30%. My investment had been wise. Quinn had moved out the previous year, replaced by a surgical resident named Cameron who worked even more hours and was even quieter. Cameron's rent covered my property taxes and HOA fees entirely, making my own housing essentially free. I'd been promoted again, now managing a team of 5 analysts. My salary had increased by 40% since I'd bought the flat. I was saving aggressively, looking at investment properties, building wealth. My grandmother called every Sunday. We had lunch once a month. She'd tell me family gossip without judgment, letting me decide what I wanted to know. Blair was still working the same full-time job, still living with roommates. According to my grandmother, she'd had a serious boyfriend for 6 months before he'd broken up with her because she wasn't financially responsible enough for a future together. She'd gained weight, lost friends, and spent most weekends alone because she couldn't afford the lifestyle she'd once funded with my money. My parents had refinanced their home purchase loan twice, each time extracting equity to cover expenses they couldn't afford otherwise. They were underwater on the property now, owing more than it was worth because of the refinancing fees and the neighborhood's decline as crime increased. The development company's renovations hadn't attracted the buyers they'd hoped for, and property values had dropped instead of rising. Blair had moved back into their basement 6 months ago, after her roommates kicked her out for not paying utilities. My parents were charging her rent again, but according to my grandmother, Blair was between jobs again and not actually paying. The cycle continued for them. The enabling, the crises, the dysfunction. But it continued without me. I hadn't spoken to my parents or Blair in 3 years. No holidays together, no phone calls, no texts. Complete severance of the relationship that had been slowly poisoning me for decades. It should have felt sad. It should have hurt. Instead, I felt free. The family I'd built. Quinn's parents who'd become mentor figures. My grandmother who'd always seen me clearly. My coworkers who'd become genuine friends. Cameron who respected boundaries and paid rent on time, was more functional than the biological family I'd left behind. Last month, I'd attended a conference on urban development. During a networking event, a woman approached me and introduced herself as a journalist writing about housing security and financial independence. She'd heard I'd successfully navigated family pressure to maintain boundaries around my property. "How did you resist?" she asked. "Most people cave when family gets involved." I thought about that question for a long time before answering. I calculated the cost of giving in versus the cost of standing firm. Giving in meant sacrificing my home, my savings, my peace of mind, and my future. Standing firm meant sacrificing relationships that were already conditional and extractive. The math wasn't even close. But didn't you feel guilty? Every day for the first year, I admitted. But then I looked around at my life, my career advancing, my finances stable, my mental health improving, and I realized guilt was the price they taught me to pay for self-preservation. Once I understood that, the guilt lost its power. The article published 2 months later. The journalist had changed my name and identifying details, but the core story was there. Woman refuses to let entitled family member move into her newly renovated property, faces intense pressure and false accusations, ultimately chooses self-preservation over family harmony. The comments section exploded. Hundreds of readers sharing similar stories of family financial exploitation, of boundaries violated, of guilt weaponized to extract resources, and hundreds more criticizing me as heartless, selfish, cruel. I read every comment with detachment. The critics were speaking from the same playbook my mother had used, that family obligation should supersede personal well-being, that blood relation created infinite debt, that saying no to exploitation was somehow worse than the exploitation itself. But the supporters understood. They'd lived it. They'd been the designated family ATM, the reliable bailout, the person expected to sacrifice endlessly because they were responsible and stable and could handle it. They'd learned the same lesson I had, that you can't pour from an empty cup, and that family who only value you for what you provide aren't actually family at all. My grandmother forwarded me the article when it appeared, though I'd already read it. "This is your story, isn't it?" she asked during our next lunch. "Parts of it," I admitted. "Your mother saw it too. She called me last night crying, saying the journalist had gotten everything wrong, that you'd twisted the truth to make Blair look bad." My grandmother stirred her tea thoughtfully. I asked her which specific facts in the article were incorrect. She couldn't name any, just kept saying it felt wrong and that families shouldn't air their issues publicly. "Did you tell her I didn't write it?" I told her that if the truth makes her uncomfortable, perhaps she should examine why the truth is so damning. My grandmother smiled slightly. She hung up on me. We're back to not speaking again. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm 82 years old. I don't have time for relationships that require me to pretend dysfunction is normal." She reached across the table to pat my hand. "You did the right thing, Sienna. You built something solid, you protected it, and you're thriving while they're still stuck in the same patterns. That's not cruelty, that's success." Last week, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "We need to talk." It was from Blair. I saw the article. "I know it's about us. I know you talked to that journalist. You're still trying to destroy me, still punishing me for one mistake years ago. But I want you to know I've changed. I'm in therapy now. I'm working on myself. And when I'm ready, I'm going to reach out for real. I'm going to want a relationship with my sister again. I hope by then you'll have forgiven me." I read the email 3 times, analyzing every sentence for manipulation, for genuine growth, for any sign that Blair had actually learned anything from the consequences of her choices. The email was carefully constructed, the admission of seeing the article followed by immediately blaming me for destroying her, the claim of change undermined by one mistake, minimizing years of exploitation, the announcement that she'd reach out when ready, as though I'd been waiting for her return. The expectation of forgiveness framed as hope, making me the villain if I didn't provide it. Classic Blair. Different words, same pattern. I deleted the email without responding. Then I blocked the address. That night, I cooked dinner in my custom kitchen, ate at the table I'd refinished myself, and watched the sunset through windows I'd installed with my own hands. Cameron was at the hospital working a double shift. The flat was quiet, peaceful, entirely mine. My life was stable. My career was thriving. My finances were secure. My relationships were reciprocal. I'd built all of this by refusing to sacrifice myself for people who saw my stability as their solution. Blair was still waiting for rescue. My parents were still enabling her. The cycle continued for them, grinding them down slowly, year by year, crisis by crisis, but I'd stepped out of that cycle. I'd built something different, something solid, something that couldn't be taken from me by guilt or manipulation or family obligation. I'd carved that turkey 3 years ago and carved out my independence in the same motion. Every slice had been deliberate, precise, final, and I'd never looked back. The flat around me stood as testament to what was possible when you chose yourself first, not out of selfishness, but out of survival. When you protected what you'd built instead of letting it be dismantled by people who contributed nothing, but demanded everything. Blair had called me heartless for setting boundaries. My parents had called me cruel for refusing to enable. The critics in that article's comments had called me selfish for prioritizing my own well-being. But here, in this space I'd created through sacrifice and discipline and refusal to bend, I knew the truth. I wasn't heartless. I was finally, after 32 years, free. And Blair was still in that basement, still waiting for someone else to solve her problems. Still wondering why her sister had abandoned her instead of understanding that I hadn't abandoned her. I'd simply stopped carrying her. The difference was everything.